Hi there, welcome to this mini tutorial where we're going to look at the difference between a 65% and a 75% graded essay so that you can understand how feedback on those essays could help you achieve your desired target, whether that's a 65 or a 75. So we're going to compare two essays, one graded at 65, one at 75. First starting point is to look at the brief, which is to write an essay that reflects on the learning from this particular unit, which was critical issues in project management, and compare it to how you would use the learning in your career. You can pause to read the entire brief, which is highlighted here. I will pick up on a couple of key points that I want to draw to your attention. So when we're thinking about how people write an essay in response to this brief, it requires them to think deeply about the learning and apply it to their career thinking, even if they're not sure where their career is headed. Things I've highlighted here are particularly important. Be sure to illustrate with examples. So I'm going to be looking for examples given in the essays, not generalities. It also says show you have engaged with the material at a detailed critical level. So again, I'm looking for detail, I'm looking for criticality. And again, remember that your aim is to show how well you have achieved this. This will become apparent when we walk through the essays. Showing, not just telling, not just asserting, not just giving opinion, not just describing, but showing, illustrating, demonstrating. Okay, now we've had a look at the brief. Let's have a look at the two submissions, our example work. And I'll bring up the scripts. And again, if you've got these in front of you, then have a read through them. Essay 1 or sample number 1 is a bit shorter than number 2, 647 words. If you don't have them in front of you, you can pause to read or scroll slowly, play back slowly through this video and read the two samples. They also provided annotated references, which is an important part of the evaluation as well. Script number 2 is a bit longer. It's 1,000 words, so it's about 30% longer, 30 to 40% longer than the first one. But we can still compare them. Once you've had a read through, think about how you would assess them. What marks would you give them and why? What are the most important features you think that address the brief? What are the positives? What are the weaknesses? What are the areas for improvement? You'll see that sample number 2 has provided much more detail on its annotated reference list as well, and this is something that we look at. So one of the things is clear is the far more references in number 2 than number 1, but that's not necessarily a problem or an advantage. It depends on what they do with those references, how they use them. Okay, so we got to the end of the samples. What did you make of them? What's your evaluation? Let's have a look at what the marks actually were. So essay number 1 was 65%, essay number 2 75%. Keep in mind that they are both strong essays. 65% means very good in qualitative terms. Essay number 2 evaluated as excellent. Let's discuss the differences. Why did we give these marks that were a grade apart? In some respects, there isn't a great deal of difference to them, but what we're interested in is that difference between the 65 and the 75, between effectively the B and the A grade. Let's have a look at sample number 1. I've highlighted a few things which I'll pick out just to exemplify why these two things are different. And you can extrapolate from that, and you'll find further examples by reading through the whole text. So this opens really strongly. That's what the green means. Critical issues in project management units help reshape my understanding of what it means to lead and deliver successful projects in today's dynamic and unpredictable work environment. It sets the scene, it's a strong statement, it gives clarity about where they're going with this, and it's confident. And the writing in this piece, although it's quite short, at only 650 words, is strong. This is a well-written piece, it's well structured, and it's very clear. So those are the strong points. Here are some areas where it could have been better. Here the writer says, these ideas reshape my understanding of leadership. It's less about control and more about creating conditions for engagement, collaboration and trust. This is all correct. It's connected to the literature. It shows that they've understood to some degree what's going on in this unit. But it's tending to stay fairly high level. You could even argue a bit descriptive rather than analytical or critical. I would expect it to go beyond this. I would expect it to now say, for example, and demonstrate some illustration here. These insights will inform how I approach future roles in client-facing or collaborative environments. This is plausible. It's absolutely appropriate. But now I want to know, show me. Show me how. Give me an example. Give me some specifics. So it's staying quite high level here. In the next example, they turn to a case we used in the unit. The Baspar case study illustrates how project failure is often not due to technical shortcomings, but to human and organizational factors such as stakeholder misalignment, etc., etc. And then they go on to connect it with literature, which is good. But again, I'd want to see some specifics here. They're staying quite high level. It's an assertion more than it is an argument. I would look for a little bit more depth here. Pick out something from this case, one or two things that's more strongly connected to Osterweil's conceptual frameworks and theories. Here's another area where, again, they've done a good job of connecting to the literature, but they're staying quite high level. I now feel better prepared to assess project needs and select appropriate frameworks. I want to see an example here. That's a declaration, it's an assertion, less argument going on here. Now they do mention waterfall, agile or hybrid methodologies with greater confidence, but again, I'd want to show an example here. For example, in a team setting, I would do X, Y, and Z in order to draw on these ideas. Let me emphasize, even though it's short, this is a very good essay, well structured. I'm convinced that they have engaged with the material, but they've stayed quite high level, almost descriptive at times. Now let's contrast that with the second sample. It's longer, and in a sense that is important because they've written more about more topics and allowed themselves more space to demonstrate their understanding. Again, it starts out really strong. This piece is a critical reflection on how deconstructing leadership myths, etc., etc., etc. So contrast this to the opening statement in the first one. So they're covering more ground here. So I'm already got a sense for they've got quite a comprehensive knowledge. They're going to take me somewhere which isn't quite narrow. It's leading in perhaps a number of related directions. And then they structure this, they break it down. They talk about leadership first. Previously, I uncritically adhered to trait theory. This is really interesting because it tells me a couple of things. It shows learning, which is remember what the brief was looking for. Connect your learning to your career through the theories that we've taught and the theories and tools and models that we've taught you. So previously, there's a contrast here. This is going to demonstrate that they've learned, they've moved from one place to another place. There's been a change here. And they're also talking about criticality. So they're demonstrating critical thinking by reflecting on what they've learned and showing that they are thinking more critically now. Again, they connected to the literature well. Here we go again. This theory practice tension manifested initially in our group's default reliance. Here, again, we wanted examples. They're connecting it directly to group work. So there's a practical example here. They've not stayed so high level and in generalities and sweeping statements. It shows that they're applying their thinking to specific situations. In this paragraph, future treatment to the unit's success in fostering pragmatic interpersonal skills. And this is something that I like because it's bringing together several ideas from the unit and demonstrating that they've grasped the learning objectives here, because this is a central theme of the unit. So showing they understand the unit, what we were getting at, and integration of themes. Then they have a separate section about discourse analysis and neuroscience. And here's a statement: this duality of language is both a weapon and a bridge, has honed my capacity to identify power dynamics. So they brought together a couple of different ideas. It's a good synthesizing statement. We didn't teach specifically this terminology, weapon and a bridge, so they're using their own words to encapsulate their learning. They're not just regurgitating, reiterating, or restating things that have been taught in the unit. They are bringing it together and showing that they can talk the language in their own terms. And again, they're using examples by applying it to a number of different things at the same time. Go back and contrast this to sample 1, which was staying kind of safe. It was reusing some of the language, not going into any great deal of depth, and showing that they had thought about it. While this unit has provided frameworks, etc., etc., its emphasis on criticality is also highlighted. This is not universally applicable. So again, looking for critical depth, self-criticism, challenging assumptions, confronting orthodoxies and arguments. This was not universally applicable. So they've drawn on some critical literature here in particular, but shown that they're not just thinking about this in as one way to treat this particular topic. They're showing there's a warning against other ways of thinking about project management in this particular case. So again, demonstrating criticality, critical thought, using critical literature, but also being self-critical too. And then they end up this paragraph by saying, I can foster environments that transform ambiguity into opportunity rather than catalyzing stress. Again, this is really interesting because they've engaged with the material. They've shown that complexity is not just one-dimensional thing. It's not just the problem, but it also creates opportunities too, demonstrating their engagement with the learning. Whereas a less accomplished piece of writing might have just said complexity is a challenge. They have gone beyond that. And here we have these frameworks reconceptualize complexity not as an obstacle but as a dynamic variable. So again, they picked up on that idea and demonstrated an integral, holistic approach, which contrasts somewhat with the previous sample, which stayed fairly high level, almost one-dimensional in some respects. But finally, as they're winding up, they end this paragraph with these tools will help convert my typical ambiguity into purposeful action. And here I wanted them to show that. Show me what you mean by that. Give me an example, either from what you did in class or how you might apply this in your career. Imagine a scenario or a situation. If I were in this particular situation, I might do X, Y, and Z. Invent a little example, a little case. I really wanted this to be more than just an assertion. I wanted it to be demonstrated by applying it to a case of their own imagining. But again, really strong, structurally coherent, very logical. They've used lots of literature here, but it's not excessive. All of the literature is relevant. They've gone beyond the core readings we've given them and engaged with all of the material that's available and connected it to their discussion in a very well integrated way. And that's backed up by their annotated references. There's no possibility here that someone has just thrown references in, as sometimes happen. You just stack up references that may be connected, maybe not connected. You're trying to show off. This isn't the case here because we can see from their annotation why they have used some of those references. So it's all very, very plausible. If there was one possibility of critique, it's almost just on the right side of being overwritten. Almost hyperbolic at places. Sometimes the language is a little bit flowery. That might be a suspicion of AI use, but this isn't the case here because of there is no evidence of that, especially the annotated bibliography. because we require students to provide outlines, or we suggest students provide outline drafts to staff in advance, we know who they are. So I know who this student was, and there is very little chance that this was outsourced to a robot for writing. But I would say you don't need to be quite as demonstrative in your language, but otherwise it's absolutely fine. There were no marks lost for that. Where they could have gotten stronger marks was a little bit more specific illustration in places. So that's a tour through the differences between those two. Both very good pieces of work, but one rose above the other because of the expanse of their knowledge and understanding demonstrated. So that brings us to the key takeaways, which are general bits of guidance for how you can use feedback and how you can think about your performance on pieces of writing and the things that you need to do. Always speak to the brief. People say this all the time. Address the brief. Think deeply about what it's asking you to do. That is so key. And remember, back at the beginning, I drew your attention to the key aspects of the assignment brief, which are about being specific and critical and using examples and showing knowledge and understanding, not just asserting it or describing it. Using clear examples, whether they're from the learning on the unit, there might be cases that you've read about, there might be examples that you've made up. Making up your own examples of how to illustrate theory and practice can be very, very powerful because you can make them do exactly what you want. Widen your reading, go above and beyond the core readings that you're given. So the first essay stayed pretty close to the core readings. They just did enough that was necessary to show that they'd used the appropriate literature. The second one went more widely, even beyond some of the things that we'd given them. Adding that critical depth, so having an argument rather than just staying descriptive, looking at contrasting ways of approaching a topic, challenging assumptions, challenging orthodox approaches, having an argument with the literature if necessary. And you're looking to show insight, especially in an assignment like this where we're asking you to reflect on your learning, apply it to where you might be heading for your career. So again, in that second piece, there were a clear couple of instances of insight where they brought together ideas and made a statement, built up an analytical argument to say, this is what I've discovered from this learning. There were 2 or 3 really good examples of that in the second one, which we highlighted. In the first one, it would be harder to say you generated some insight here because it was mostly declarations or assertions, which were very plausible, but they were easy to gather from the literature. It was harder to tell in the first essay that they'd really brought those out from their own learning. So I'd say, in broad terms, the first essay was playing it safe, very competent, very well structured, very well written. The second one was adding that edge, that sharper, critical depth, and argumentative, analytical power that we expect from an essay that's going to rise into the 70s. So I hope that's been useful for you to think about the difference between a 65 and a 75, between a B and an A, and the feedback I've given on those essays would be the evidence that we would use to substantiate those marks, and that those are things that you can think about when writing your own pieces of work. The key features you need to look for to make your essay writing rise from the 60s into the 70s and potentially even beyond that.